in which he stressed the central importance of property not only in practical respect, but also as an analytical tool. Right? All reasoning about human behavior, about human action must involve and must start from the concept of private property. And in the late 19th century then, and in the 20th century, the same approach was taken up and developed by the Austrian School of Economics. What makes the Austrians unique today, and why you need a Mises Brazil, is because the Austrians, unfortunately, are the only ones who are still upholding this. For reasons that would lead us now way too far astray, all other schools of economic thought have abandoned this tradition, have deviated from it in various ways. There was a technical deviation, right, in which economists became primarily occupied with the development of new analytical techniques and so on, bringing mathematics and econometrics and so on into economic analysis and forgetting the larger picture, right, falling into error in these various ways. Other schools of economics were, of course, from the outset thoroughly opposed to the whole notion of natural liberty. For example, the Marxists fell prey ultimately to the very basic error that I briefly mentioned at the beginning of my talk, namely the idea that you could define liberty without, as being a condition without any obstacles at all. And that's Marx's definition of liberty. So as a consequence, Marx thinks that the ultimate thing that needs to be done once you have eradicated all tyrants and all kings and so on is to get rid of property altogether, because property is the last obstacle that stands in the way of full liberty. So Marx thinks that human beings could do what only God can do, namely creating liberty without any obstacles. So the Austrians today are upholding a tradition that reaches back at least until the first scholastics, the disciples of St. Thomas. Right? A tradition that defines justice, well-ordered society around the concept of property, of what belongs to each, the suum cuique. And this conception has been enriched in the past 200 years by taking account of the economic dimension. And the economic dimension has informed us especially about the consequences of violations of this order, because this was fairly abstract. Right? You violate property rights, okay, you end up in hell. Right? But what the economists have shown is, while you violate property rights, then you get shortages and surpluses on the economy, you get economic crisis and other nasty things, you get huge income differentials, as the ones that we have had in the past 30 or 40 years, right, being the consequence of inflationist policies. Right? All this has been possible only thanks to the development of economic theory. It was not possible before. So we can reject, we are in the happy position therefore today that we can reject government interventions not only because it's immoral, because they are immoral, but also because they entail various nasty material consequences. It's not that therefore we will find much hearing in the capital cities here in Brazil and in other countries, but right, we will find the hearing of all people of goodwill and who eventually will become a majority. Now, simultaneously to this development that I've just outlined, the opposition, the forces of evil, so to say, also gained some ground. And although we could trace them back much earlier, I will start my recital of the forces of evil with the Enlightenment movement in the 18th, or let's say late 17th and then 18th century. The Enlightenment people took up the conception of liberty of antiquity. That is, they defined liberty as being relative to political power only. Only political power could create a condition of liberty for its citizens. And so the government was, in fact, the source of liberty, was the source of order. You see, so they come up with this idea, it's kind of a reactionary movement, right? They dish this up again at the end of the 17th and then in the 18th century, although, in fact, this whole notion had been overcome now for 2 or 3 centuries. The facts were clear, the case was patent, that social order in a well-ordered society can extend far beyond the political borders of any king or of any democracy. Right? So they come back and say, no, in any case, it should be the other way around. They have the conception that government is the true spring out of which flow liberty and order. And they combine this with a mechanic view of man, contrary to what is sometimes presented in histories of the Enlightenment and so on. In fact, the Enlightenment philosophers in France in particular, Rousseau, Voltaire, Helvetius, and all the others, did not have a particularly elevated notion of man. Rather, for them, mankind fell by and large into two groups. One group was the huge mass of people who had no free will, in fact, at all. They were entirely determined by outside forces. They were machines, unthinking machines, cattle. And the other group was a very small minority that was themselves and their friends. They were, in fact, the only ones to make any choice at all, and they had, therefore, not only the right, but also the mission to create society or create conditions for society, a legal framework such that the desired outcomes would entail. Right? All others behave like machines, so they, as the social philosophers, only have to create the right laws so that all others would be determined to go into the desired direction and create happiness and wealth for everybody. That was by and large their conception of society. So today we would call this social engineering. Right? It's an expression that only emerged in the 20th century, and Hayek used it. But in fact, this is exactly the conception that we find already in the 18th century in the whole philosophy that leads up to the French Revolution. After the French Revolution, in the 1810s, we see the emergence of liberalism. The word liberalism is used for the first time, as most of you know, in the Spanish Parliament, where one group of representatives call themselves the liberales, those who seek liberty. Now, liberalism, classical liberalism, was a very mixed bag. It had two inspirations. One was of an Anglo-Saxon or Scottish type, as Hayek has underlined. And this Anglo-Saxon inspiration, this Anglo-Saxon tradition of liberalism relied on the origins, on the roots that were developed in the Middle Ages and then through the schoolmen. The other root was the Enlightenment movement. And that was, unfortunately, the majority among the liberals of the early 19th century. So those liberals had a very strong opposition against anything that resembled organized religion. They were atheists, sometimes very militant atheists. They thought that man was a machine, and that therefore the duty of the lawmaker was to create conditions favorable, that pushed the different market participants into desired forms of behavior, etc. So we today, I think, we cannot fully identify with classical liberalism. I felt for a long time, well, as classical liberalism, the classical liberals were the predecessors of the modern Austrian school and of Austro-libertarianism. But in fact, if we look at the historical record somewhat carefully, we must be prudent, right? So in many ways, classical liberalism, what we call classical liberalism, was a deviation. It was a mixed bag that not relied on the crucial elements that we consider to be important, self-ordering society, starting from the concept of private property, but on the ancient conception of liberty springing only from political power. And we see a repeat of the same intellectual error in the 20th century in the case of the neoliberal movement. The word neoliberalism emerges, or is used for the first time, in the German literature of the 1930s. And the people who use it want to distance themselves from classical liberalism. they found that classical liberalism was too libertarian. They had in fact swallowed root and branch the Marxist interpretation of 19th century history. The Marxists had said, look, we had created the conditions of capitalism, freedom under the sole rule of law and the sole rule of property rights. Look what this has given us. Mass misery for the working classes and economic crisis. So obviously, this doesn't work. It doesn't give us the desired results, and on top of this, it impoverishes us. So we need to come up with something new, and in this new conception, we need to leave some room for individual freedom. So the conception that they developed was essentially the same one that the Enlightenment philosophers had, and essentially the same one that the Roman and Greek philosophers had, namely that all freedom flows from the government, and that the duty of the government is to set a framework of conditions, a framework of laws that determine all the market participants to adopt behavior that is socially desirable, that is desirable from the point of view of the politicians. And their error was, of course, well, manifold. First of all, they erred historically. It was not the case that the liberalization reforms of the 19th century had entailed mass misery for the masses. It was precisely the other way around. In no history, in no period of history before, and even in our own day, except for maybe for the globalization of the past 30 years, has the condition of the masses of people ever been increased at such a fast rate. And that was in particular the case in the second half of the 19th century. It was unprecedented increases of the real wages of the working population. They erred also in the interpretation of economic crisis. There were regular financial crises in the 19th century, and they all originated, or most of them originated anyway, in the financial sector. And that was precisely because the financial sector was not free from government intervention, but was the one sector where government intervened ever more. And I mentioned before that our present crisis can be traced back to decades-long government interventions in monetary affairs. In fact, governments have always tried to control the money supply, because that's an additional source of income for governments. And these interventions have not been given up in the 19th century, but have been reinforced in the 19th century. So we observe already in the 19th century the same problems that we find today on a much larger scale. And in Nietzsche, it's the same kind of problem. You have central banks bailing out commercial banks, refinancing commercial banks. Commercial banks, therefore, engage in unsustainable business practices, right? They run down their liquidity, run down equity, engage in very risky investments, and every 10 years or so, the whole thing blows up.